Hey guys, welcome to the Confirmation 2 makeup lesson for January 23rd. This was a very important lesson, but a very hard one, because we're dealing with the problem of evil. You know, why do bad things happen to good people, that kind of thing. A lot of you have asked about that. And it's very hard. And I'm going to tell you right now that there's two answers. There's two sides to the answer. There's the intellectual side. You know, I can explain reasons to you. I can give you a way to understand it. But the thing is, there's also our hearts. And the fact is that you could have the greatest teacher, give you the greatest explanation, and you could understand it greater than anybody ever has. And the next time somebody kills his 5-year-old daughter or something, or some terrible thing happens, or your friend dies, or when something happens, your heart's gonna wrench. For that, we need to remember, ultimately, I can't give you all the answers. God needs to do that. Remember that God became man, and He went through it. He went through the suffering. He saw His friends suffer. We know Jesus wept when Lazarus died. We know He went through all the suffering of the cross. So somehow we know it's worth it because God did it. And so when we see that, we need to remember God loves us more than anybody else. He's the one that made us. He's the one that really cares about us, that sees things from a very deep perspective. God's the one that, even more than our parents and family and friends, He loves us. And He allows it, and He went through it. He can speak to your heart. I can't. I'm going to give you some reasons, and I'm going to do it quickly because we only have a few minutes. But remember, Christ, God, He did it. And He did it in a very visible way on the cross. He wants us to know, I went through it. He wants us to remember, hey, I've been there. I did this. He wants us to know that because He knows this is very hard. So after I give you this explanation from a very intellectual level, remember, only God can speak to your heart. Use this as a foundation and turn to God. So, from an intellectual standpoint, the strongest, most airtight, really, argument about evil goes something like this. It says, people of faith believe that God is three things: all-knowing, He knows everything; all-loving, He loves everyone; and all-powerful, He can do anything. Yet evil exists. Suffering exists. If God is all three of these things, evil can't exist. Because if it did, He would know about it, want to do something about it, and be able to. And so He would. You can have any two of the three. You can have a God who is not all-knowing. So even though He wants to do something about the evil and is able, He doesn't know about the evil, and so He can't fix that. You could have a God who is not all-powerful. So He knows about all the evil. He's all-loving and wants to do something about it, but He's not able to. And worst of all, you could have a God who's just not all-loving. He's not all good. He knows about all the evil that's out there, and He has the power to do something about it, but He doesn't, because He just doesn't love. But the argument says you can't have all three, which is what we say that we have. So how do we deal with this argument? Well, let's focus on that last one, about God not being all-loving, being a possible scenario. I'm going to put it in a logical way, okay? We believe, as people of faith, okay, here's what people of faith believe, that God created, okay, everything that exists. Okay, this is what is believed. That's what we believe. Two, we also know, anybody that's been outside for more than 5 minutes knows, that evil exists. Right? So logically, philosophically, your conclusion, inescapable, airtight, is that God created evil. That's how the argument goes. And I'm going to tell you, this is a very, very tight, very perfect, logical argument. If this is true, which we say it is, and if this is true, which everybody sees evil, then this has to be true. So that's a problem for people who believe in evil, or for people who believe in God, isn't it? So how do we deal with this? Well, let's sidetrack for a minute, okay? If I wrote on the board 7 minus 7 equals what? It equals 0. But believe it or not, for most of human history, people did not think there was 0. Why? Let's say I asked you to give me 5 pennies in my hand. You could do that, right? Or I said to you, find me a 10-foot log. I'm building a shelter. Well, you could do that. Or I said to you, herd all the sheep into the barn. Well, you could do that too. But if I said to you, give me 0 pennies, or find me a 0-foot log, or put 0 sheep here, give me 0 sheep, you really can't do it. Now, it's easy to say, yeah, here's 0 pennies. Or, here's 0 sheep. But that isn't really true. Saying here's 0 sheep has nothing to do with sheep. Saying here's 0 pennies, you haven't done anything that has anything to do with pennies. You really haven't. And so the ancient peoples who all dealt with real things didn't think there was a 0. They just didn't. From a philosophical standpoint, what you're doing if you say, here are 0 sheep, you're giving me an emptiness into which you could put sheep. So in other words, here's 0 pennies. Well, what that means is that really, there's an emptiness here, and theoretically, there could be pennies. There's not, but there could be. So, without going through the whole history of 0, eventually 0 came to be developed because people who used to count just by making marks and eventually needed to count up to really big numbers, imagine making 1,000 marks, right? Very inconvenient. Eventually came up with what we have today, the place system, where if you have a number, okay, 532, this is the ones place, and this is the tens place, and this is the hundreds place, right? And eventually what happened is, well, what if you wanted to represent that you had 5 hundreds and 3 ones, but no tens? You needed a system, a symbol to say that, and so people came up with the 0. Because the 0, a big, empty circle, all the symbols that developed all around the world for saying you have none of something had something to do with emptiness. Because that's what you're saying, that you have an emptiness into which you could put something. You have an emptiness into which we could put sheep. Or you have an emptiness into which you could put some tens. Okay? It's the same thing with evil. Believe it or not, when you start to think about what's the best way to define evil, and you try to figure out how do you describe what is evil, you realize that you can't define evil as anything that exists. It doesn't work. What does work is to say that evil is an emptiness into which you could put good. So that second thing, remember I said God created all that exists, evil exists, therefore God created evil? No, evil doesn't exist. Evil is an emptiness into which you could put good. In some cases, it's easy to understand this. A homeless man. Obviously, there's a lot of good there that you could do. Someone could help him. He is missing a house, which is a good thing. Maybe he's missing a job, which is a good thing. Obviously, it's easy to see there how there's an emptiness into which good could be placed, even just the good of me helping him. In other things, a disease, a hurricane, a natural disaster, it's harder to see, and we talked more about that in the actual lesson. We don't have time now. And so that's the reality of it. Now, the question is, why does God permit an emptiness into which you could put good? And the reason, as I'm sure many of you have already guessed, and many people guessed when I talked about this that night, is free will. Remember, we've talked many times about God who does not force himself on any of us. Love is a choice. God's not going to make us love him. God's not going to make us love. If I kill somebody, the good that's missing is my respect for their life. I don't even love them enough to care if they're alive. And God respects that ability to choose and doesn't force me to love that person, even a little bit. He doesn't even force me to love him enough to care that he stays alive. Because love is a choice, and God lets us be free. And so in many, many cases, the reason there's evil is because God lets us have free will. The only way that we can love is by being free to choose to. And God says love is more important than suffering. But then it gets even harder to see when we think about, well, what about natural disasters and diseases and all these things? Some people believe that humanity is so intimately linked to creation because remember, the earth and everything was made for us. It was a gift for us from God. Some believe that because of the evil that we did, the original sin, it just messed all of creation up and there wouldn't have been natural disasters and diseases and things like that before. That might be true. But even if there would have been, the fact is we have to realize our priorities are all messed up because we have a fallen human nature. We don't see reality the way it really is. Look, I know not all of you, unfortunately, understand and buy into the concept of heaven and hell and all that. A lot of people don't. A lot of people fortunately do. But I want you to consider that there are people, there are priests, there are nuns, there are people who really believe very strongly that we're just here for a few years. And then there's either eternal happiness in heaven or eternal torment and suffering in hell. And they really strongly believe this. And still, these people sin. They'll do one little thing that makes them happy or feel good or something for a few minutes. And then that's it. And they know that that could make them suffer forever. Why would people do that if they really believe that? It's because our human nature is fallen. We're all slaves to sin. We all have this temptation. We all have disordered priorities. And I tell you that so that you can understand this idea. When someone dies, right, are we sad? Yeah. And there's nothing wrong with that. But if you really think about it, and you really think that that person's gone to heaven, shouldn't we be happy for that person? See what I mean? Just part of being human is not always seeing things the way they ought to be, the way they are. And so, if we had not fallen, if human nature had never fallen, we would see things in a very different way, and we would not experience pain and suffering and bad things as evil. We'd experience them just as realities, and we'd recognize them, but we'd have our priorities right, and we'd recognize that in the end, there's heaven. In the end, there's God. All these people have died in an earthquake. They're with God now. Let's do what we can to make life better here on earth while we wait to go there too. And so that's a really hard thing to buy into. And only God is going to be able to help our hearts to understand that. Because it's a really challenging, hard thing. But remember, and this is what we start with and end with because it's most important. Remember that he went through it. We don't understand it all the way, but it's worth it. Somehow, he did this because he loves us. And he did it so that we would remember. It is worth it. We might not understand it. Even throughout our whole lives, we may never get to the point of really grasping it. But he cares. And he went through it. And he was there. So please take the quiz so that I know that you've watched this. But you know what? Even more than that, I beg you, please pray about this. Ask God to speak to your heart. This is one of the hardest things in life. Is realizing that bad things happen to people that are good. Or to people who, bad things happen. Ask God to speak to your heart. Use this as a foundation, all I've explained to you, but let God show you how he sees things. And pray for that grace of wisdom to see that. God bless.